Have you ever looked at the person you trust most and realized they are a complete stranger? For me, that moment happened not in a dark alley, but under the glittering chandelier in my own dining room. He called me a thief in front of all our friends. He didn't know that I didn't just have receipts. I had the recording. My name is Alara, and I am an expert in the art of disappearance. Tonight, my stage was our penthouse, overlooking a cold, glittering Boston. Every surface in the dining room was a mirror, the polished mahogany table, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the ridiculous number of wine glasses. I had checked each one 3 times for smudges. Everything had to be perfect. This dinner was not a social gathering. It was a military operation, and Julian was its general. My husband, Julian, was a man who did not just enter a room, he conquered it. He was a fund manager, a master of the universe in a $7,000 suit, and tonight he was the star. He moved through the living room, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that cut through the polite, false laughter of our guests. His target was Robert Vance, his boss, a man with a face like carved granite and eyes that missed nothing. This entire evening, the seared scallops, the vintage Cabernet, my strained smile was an offering to him. I drifted on the edges of their conversations, a shadow in a silk dress. My only role was to be the perfect accessory, the silent mechanism that kept the machine running. I smiled when spoken to, refilled glasses before they were empty, and laughed softly at jokes that were not funny. I was invisible, and that was exactly how Julian liked it. "Ilara, my angel," Julian's voice boomed, his hand landing heavy on the small of my back. The heat of it felt less like affection and more like ownership. I flinched, almost imperceptibly. He was steering me toward Vance. "Isn't she amazing? Runs her own data analysis and still manages to pull all this together." Vance nodded, his eyes appraising me. "A miracle worker. Then, she is," Julian said, giving me a squeeze that was just a little too hard. It was a public performance, and his pats were always condescending, a signal to everyone that I was his, a beautiful, competent pet. I smiled, the muscles in my cheeks aching. "I just try to keep up, Robert." As I turned to check on the caterer, I felt the familiar coil of dread tighten in my stomach. It had been there all week, a low, thrumming anxiety. Julian had been on edge, pacing the study, his phone calls hushed and angry. He blamed market volatility and financial issues. He insisted I would not understand. But I understood data, and the data I saw the strained set of his jaw. The way he snapped at me for using the wrong credit card told me this was more than just the market. My gaze drifted across the room and landed on her. Chloe. Julian's new protégé at Viridian Dynamics. She was in her mid-20s, sharp in a way that cut, and she wore a blood-red dress that matched her lipstick. She was everything I was not: loud, ambitious, and utterly unbothered. She was currently laughing at something Julian had said, her head tilted back, her hand lingering on his forearm. She caught me looking. Her smile did not falter, but her eyes changed. They swept over me, from my carefully chosen conservative navy dress to my sensible heels. It was not a look of aggression. It was worse. It was pity. A clear, distinct, soul-crushing pity. As if I were a relic, something to be politely acknowledged before being discarded. I turned away, my breath catching. The air in the penthouse felt suddenly thick, suffocating. The smell of expensive perfume and roast lamb was making me nauseous. The fake laughter, the clinking crystal, the cold gaze of Chloe, it was all pressing in. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, my knuckles white. Julian's voice rose again, calling for another toast. I just needed to get through the night. Just a few more hours of perfection, of invisibility. Then I could be alone, and I could breathe. I smoothed my dress, picked up the wine bottle, and stepped back into the light, my smile perfectly, agonizingly, in place. The main course plates had been cleared, the air, heavy with the scent of expensive wine and roasted duck, had settled into a comfortable lull. Julian pushed his chair back, the heavy carved wood scraping almost imperceptibly against the marble floor. He stood, lifting his crystal wine glass. He tapped it lightly with the edge of his dessert fork. Ting! The sound was delicate, but it carried the weight of a gavel. All conversation Robert Vance's anecdote about the market, Chloe's high-pitched laugh, the polite murmurs of the other guests stopped instantly. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Every eye snapped to Julian, who basked in the attention. He was the sun, and we were all just satellites. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he began, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. It was the voice that charmed billions out of investors, the voice that had charmed me. He smiled, a practiced, humble smile that did not reach his eyes. "Robert, friends, thank you all for being here. It means the world to us." He raised his glass. "I was just speaking with my team at Viridian this week, and I was reminded of the one, single virtue that separates the winners from the losers, the only one that truly matters in our business." He paused, letting the silence stretch, commanding the space. "Loyalty." He took a slow look around the table, and its close cousin, trust. Beside me, I saw Robert Vance give a short, approving nod, his stony face softening slightly. Across the table, Chloe was leaning forward, her chin propped on her hand, gazing up at Julian. Her expression was one of pure, unfiltered adoration. It was almost reverent, but I felt something else. My heart, which had been beating a nervous but steady rhythm, gave a sudden, painful kick against my ribs. The dread that had been a low thrum all night began to spike. I knew this speech. I had heard variations of it for years, but the word trust hung in the air differently tonight. It felt heavy and metallic, like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. This was not just a performance for his boss. This was a preamble. Julian's gaze swept the room, gliding past Vance, past the other investors, and finally landing on me. He held my gaze. His smile was still fixed in place, but the warmth had evaporated. It was now just a baring of teeth, a predator's assessment. "And of course," he continued, his voice dropping half an octave, becoming more intimate, more sincere, "that trust, it isn't just for the boardroom. It isn't just for the client accounts." He held my eyes. I wanted to look away, to check on the dessert, to busy myself with a non-existent stain on the tablecloth. But I was frozen, pinned by his gaze and the focused attention of 8 other people. "It starts right here," he said, gesturing vaguely to the room. "It starts at home." The room was silent. I could feel the heat of my own skin. "I have worked," he said, turning slightly to address the room again, though his words were clearly a volley aimed at me. "Every single day for 15 years to build this life, this view." He gestured to the floor-to-ceiling windows, to the glittering Boston skyline that lay like a carpet of diamonds at our feet. This wonderful, incredible life that we all get to enjoy. The "we" felt inclusive, but the gesture was singular. His life. "It requires sacrifices," he said, looking down at the dark liquid in his glass as if it held some profound secret. "It requires, vigilance. It's a heavy burden, managing it all. The investments, the portfolios, the joint finances, making sure everything is secure, making sure everyone is protected." The coil in my stomach snapped tight, cutting off my breath. Joint finances. There it was. My right hand, which had been resting in my lap, moved under the heavy linen tablecloth. I found the hem of my silk dress and gripped it, twisting the fabric until my knuckles ached and my fingernails bit into my palm. The sharp, grounding pain was the only thing keeping me anchored to the chair. This was not spontaneous. This was calculated. Every word, every pause, every perfectly timed glance. He had practiced this. The way he framed himself as the guardian, the protector, bearing his burden with such noble suffering. He was setting a stage. He was painting a picture for them. The room was no longer a dining room. It had transformed into a courtroom, and I was being silently maneuvered into the defendant's chair. I could only watch, trapped in the suffocating silence, as he took a slow sip of his wine, lowered the glass, and prepared for the killing blow. Julian placed his wine glass on the table. The small click of crystal on linen was the only sound in the room. He sighed, a deep, sorrowful exhale that seemed to drain the energy from the air. He looked down at his hands, a perfect portrait of a man grappling with a heavy burden. "So," he began, his voice now quiet, intimate, and laced with a terrible theatrical sadness. "You can all imagine my shock, my absolute devastation, when I discovered a profound violation of that trust." He paused, letting the words hang, heavy and toxic, over the polished table. "Not in the office, not with a client." He shook his head slowly, as if the thought itself was too painful. "But right here, in my own home." The shift was instantaneous, a violent change in atmospheric pressure. Every head at the table, which had been turned toward Julian in rapt attention, swiveled. 8 pairs of eyes, curious, shocked, hungry, snapped onto me. The weight of their collective gaze was physical. I felt a hot, prickling wave of adrenaline flood my system, a visceral heat crawling up my neck and across my cheeks. I was no longer the hostess. I was the exhibit. "Ilara," he said. My name. He spoke it so gently, his voice full of feigned disappointment and sorrow. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. "My angel, is there anything you'd like to confess?" The room began to distort. The glittering lights of the Boston skyline outside the window blurred, the edges of the room softening and then shrinking, the walls closing in. The air, moments ago filled with polite laughter, felt suddenly thick and unbreathable. There was only Julian's face, etched with concern, and the ring of staring faces, frozen in expectation. My mouth was dry. My voice, when it finally came, was a barely audible rasp. "Julian, what are you talking about?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if my denial was the final, heartbreaking blow. "Please, Ilara, don't do this. Not here." He turned to the table, his hands spread in a gesture of helpless apology. "I am so sorry, everyone. Truly. I tried so hard to handle this privately." He turned back to me. The mask of the wounded husband slipped. His eyes turned cold, hard. The performance was over. $50,000, Ilara. The number was a physical blow. I flinched as if he had thrown his glass. $50,000, he repeated, his voice clear and cutting, "has disappeared from our joint investment account." He let the silence stretch, allowing the accusation to settle onto me like a shroud. "An account," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, precise whisper, "that you knew was not to be touched. An account tied directly to our partnership. An account you had no business being in." A sound rippled through the guests, a collective, sharp intake of breath. I saw Robert Vance, Julian's boss, lean forward slightly. His heavy brows drew together, not in confusion, but in a deep, immediate frown of displeasure. He was not looking at Julian. He was looking at me. His eyes narrowed, calculating the risk of this domestic, financial mess. Across the table, I saw Chloe. Her manicured hand flew to her mouth, her shoulders shaking in a perfect pantomime of shock. But her eyes, above her fingers, told the real story. They were wide, electric, and dancing with pure, unadulterated triumph. She was not just a spectator, she was enjoying the execution. Julian locked his gaze on mine, his expression now one of grim resolution. He had them. He had the whole room. "I gave you every chance," he said, shaking his head. "I asked you about the discrepancy all week. I kept asking if everything was all right, and you just kept lying." "You lied straight to my face." He looked away from me, addressing his boss, his guests. "I had no choice," he said, his voice cracking with just the right amount of emotion. "She has been stealing from me." Stealing. He had used the word. Thief. The room dissolved. The faces of the guests, the glittering chandelier, the skyline of Boston, it all blurred into a sickening, spinning watercolor. I was sinking, the polite silence of the room a heavy ocean pressing down on me. I could feel their eyes. I was no longer Alara, the hostess. I was a spectacle. I saw the pity in Robert Vance's wife's eyes, a quick, downward glance that said, "Oh, you poor, foolish girl." I saw the barely concealed smirk on Chloe's face, a glint of sheer vicious pleasure. I was their entertainment. Julian's accusation was the main course, and my humiliation was the dessert. He stood there, the picture of the wronged husband, savoring the silence he had created. He had absolute control. Then he delivered the final, theatrical flourish. "I'm so sorry, everyone," he said again, his voice thick with false grief. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his sleek, crocodile leather wallet. He fumbled with it for a moment, a perfect pantomime of a man unsteady with emotion. He pulled out a single gleaming platinum credit card. My card. The supplementary card he had given me, the one he used to track my every purchase, from groceries to coffee. "I'm sorry, honey," he said, his voice dropping, "but I have to cut this. We can't have any more. Temptations." My stomach dropped. He wouldn't. Not here. He turned to the antique sideboard against the wall, the one where we kept the serving platters. He opened the top drawer, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out a heavy pair of silver-handled desk scissors. He held the card up for everyone to see, the platinum catching the light. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, and with his other hand, he opened the scissors. He looked right at me, and he cut. The sound was small, but it was the only sound in the world, a dry, sharp, plastic snap. That noise. It was the sound of a bone breaking. It was the sound of a spell shattering. Something inside me, the thing that had been clenched in fear for 5 long years, did not just break. It vaporized. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the nights I had spent worrying about his moods, all the times he had corrected me, belittled my little data job, and gently explained our finances to me as if I were a child. It all rushed to the surface. He had spent half a decade convincing me I was small, that I was fragile, that I was nothing without him. He had built a cage of financial control and emotional manipulation and called it love. The hot tears that had been scalding the backs of my eyes did not fall. They dried. The suffocating pressure in my chest, the feeling of drowning, simply vanished. The panic receded, and in its place, a stillness settled, a cold, heavy, terrifying calm. My hands, which had been gripping my dress under the table, were perfectly still. My breathing, which had been shallow and fast, became slow and even. I was no longer drowning. I was standing on the ocean floor, and I could suddenly see everything with perfect, crystalline clarity. He thought he was executing me. He thought this was his final, brilliant move to paint me as the unstable, spendthrift wife. He had become so arrogant, so convinced of his own brilliance, that he had forgotten one critical piece of data. He had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten what I do. He had just made a fatal miscalculation. I let the silence hang for 1 beat longer, letting him believe he had won. Then, slowly, I lifted my hands from my lap. I uncurled my fingers, picked up my heavy linen napkin, folded it once, and placed it on the table. I pushed my chair back, the sound a low, deliberate scrape against the marble floor. I stood up. Julian's performance-ready face faltered. A flicker of genuine confusion, of annoyance, crossed his features. This was not part of his script. I looked at him, not at the guests. I looked directly into his eyes. My voice, when I spoke, was not a whisper. It was not a sob. It was level, clear, and cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Julian, you're right," I said. "We absolutely do need to talk about the finances." Julian's face, which had been a mask of calculated sorrow, now twitched, annoyance. He had lost control of the narrative, and it infuriated him. He hadn't just lost the script, he had realized I was holding a new one. "Ilara, sit down," he commanded, his voice a low, harsh growl, the polished performance cracking. "You are embarrassing yourself." "Don't make this worse than it already is." I looked at him, truly looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. The man I had feared was just a bully who had lost his audience. "Oh, no," I said. My voice didn't waver. It was clean, resonant, and echoed slightly in the stunned silence. "I am not going to make it worse. Julian, I am going to make things perfectly clear." I turned away from the table, away from the frozen, staring guests. My movements were slow, deliberate. I was not rushing. I was not panicked. I was a data analyst presenting her findings. I walked toward the far wall of the dining room. On it hung an 8K, 85-inch smart television, flat against the dark wood paneling. It was Julian's pride. He used it to show off his market-tracking software, to display charts of his own supposed genius to dinner guests. He loved that television. As I approached it, I heard a sound from the table, a sharp, high-pitched titter of a laugh. It was Chloe. "Oh my God," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What is she going to do now? Show us her bank statement, prove she only spent, what, 40,000? She laughed again, convinced of her own wit, still secure in her position as the winner. I ignored her. I reached the television. My dress, a simple navy silk sheath, had one hidden feature Julian had never bothered to notice: a small, concealed pocket sewn into the seam. I slipped my fingers inside and my hand closed around a tiny, cold piece of metal. I pulled it out. A small, encrypted USB drive. "Something like that," I said, my voice carrying back to the table. I reached to the side of the massive screen, found the input panel, and slotted the drive home. The click was tiny, but it felt as loud as the scissors snapping the card. The television screen, which had been displaying a neutral, abstract art screensaver, flickered to black. "Julian," I said, turning back to him. His face was no longer annoyed. It was tight. A new expression was dawning. "You always told me I was just a numbers girl. You said I couldn't see the big picture. You said I didn't understand the complexity of your world." The screen behind me lit up, bright white, projecting a single centered title. "You were wrong." The change in him was immediate. The blood drained from his face. His arrogance, his confidence, all the air that held him up, seemed to rush out of him. He didn't just recognize the drive, he recognized the look in my eyes. He knew what I was capable of analyzing. "Ilara," he said, and his voice was different. The performance was gone. The command was gone. It was replaced by a raw, guttural panic. "Turn it off." He started to stand up, his chair scraping violently. "Turn it off, now. This is private family business." "Sit down, Julian." The voice was not mine. It was Robert Vance. Vance's hand was raised, palm out, stopping Julian mid-motion. The boss's face was granite again, but his eyes were like hot coals. He was a man who hated being lied to, and he was just now realizing he was the biggest fool in the room. "No," Vance said, his voice quiet but absolute. "You stay seated." He turned his cold gaze from Julian to me, standing by the screen. He gave a single, curt nod. "You made this a public accusation. Julian, the lady gets a public defense. Let her speak." The bright white screen changed. The new header was black text on a clean white background, stark and official. Viridian Fund Flow Analysis and Associated Accounts. Prepared by E. Vance. I had used my married name. I wanted him to feel that small, extra twist of the knife. Julian's face was no longer pale. It was sheet white, a waxy, bloodless mask. He looked like he was going to be sick. I turned my back to him and addressed the screen, and the room, as if I were in a boardroom. My voice was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of the emotion that had choked me just moments before. This was my world. This was data. "Let's begin. Shall we?" I said, using the small remote I'd kept with the USB. "We'll start with the appetizer, the $50,000 I supposedly stole." I clicked. The screen changed. Slide 1. A clean screenshot of a bank transfer summary. It showed, just as Julian had claimed, a single transaction. Amount $50,000 from joint portfolio, J and E. Vance to redacted. "This, I assume, is what has you so upset," I said. "A transfer, initiated by me, 3 days ago, for $50,000. Just as you said." I heard a small noise from Chloe, a smug little "I knew it" sound. Julian just stared, his jaw muscles locked. Now, Julian claimed I was lying when he asked me about it. That is correct. I did lie. But he also claimed I stole it, which implies I spent it on... I don't know. Shoes, a spa day. I turned to look at the guests. That seems to be the assumption he wanted you all to make. But let's look at the trace. I clicked. Slide 2. A detailed wire transfer receipt. The flow of data from one account to another. The redacted destination was now fully visible. To Delaware Escrow Services, LLC, account 94B Trust. I didn't steal it. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "I moved it. I secured it. Because I knew this dinner was coming. I knew you were getting desperate." I let that hang for a moment before clicking again. Slide 3. A scanned document. A legal filing from 6 years ago. The header read, "The Estate of Martha Grayson, Elara Vance, Trust Provisions." "You see," I explained to the room, "that $50,000 was not ours. It was mine. It was the last disbursement from my grandmother's trust, a trust which you, Julian, accidentally commingled into our joint investment portfolio last year." So, I put just enough pressure on the word accidentally to make it sound like the accusation it was. "You told me it was cleaner for tax purposes. You told me it was safer under your management. What you meant was it was easier for you to leverage." I turned to face him fully. "I didn't steal from you. I reclaimed what was mine before you could gamble it away. I took back my own money." Julian shot up from his chair, his face a mask of purple rage and sheer panic. This is a misunderstanding. It's a joke, Elara. This is a complex financial arrangement you wouldn't understand." "No." My voice was as sharp and final as the scissors he had used on my card. I didn't raise my voice. I lowered it, and the cold finality of it made him stop. He froze, half standing. "There is no misunderstanding," I said. "The only misunderstanding is why you were so frantic about a mere $50,000, and I found the answer to that, too." I turned back to the screen. "You aren't missing $50,000, Julian. You're trying to find a way to plug a $5 million hole." I clicked the remote. Slide 4. A new title appeared. "The Cayman Deficit, a $5,000 discrepancy." The room was not just quiet, it was dead. The only sound in the entire penthouse was the faint, electronic hum of the television. The $5 million deficit hung on the screen, a silent, screaming accusation. The room had ceased to be a dining room. It was a tomb. I could feel their eyes on my back. But I was no longer there. My mind was 6 months in the past, back to the precise moment the perfectly constructed reality of my marriage began to fracture. It did not start with a lipstick stain, or a late-night phone call, or the scent of another woman's perfume. I would have almost preferred that. It would have been simpler, more human. No, it started with something Julian valued far more than fidelity, his own meticulous, obsessive organization. It started with carelessness. Julian, a man who color-coded his sock drawer and aligned the bills in his wallet by serial number, left his work laptop at home. It was a Tuesday, 6 months ago. He had been agitated all morning, a low-level static humming around him, and in his rush, he had simply forgotten it on the hall console. I found it there when I came home from the gym. I had no intention of looking. I had been conditioned for 5 years to believe his work was a sacred, complex text I was too simple to read, but as I went to move it to his study, the screen lit up. A single email notification was visible on the lock screen. From Viridian Risk Management subject warning. Unusual transfer flagged. Vance Fund. Vance Fund. Robert Vance's personal fund. I stared at it for a full minute. My first instinct was to look away, to erase what I had seen. It was a mistake. I was violating his trust. But the word unusual snagged in my brain. My entire job, the one Julian so often dismissed, was to find the unusual. I left the laptop in his study and told myself to forget it. But the data points had begun to cluster. A week later, Julian delivered a long, patronizing speech over dinner about how we needed to tighten our belts for a few quarters. Market volatility, he'd said. Complex algorithms I would not understand. I had nodded and agreed, and felt the familiar, dull shame of being the financially unaware partner. 3 days after that, while cleaning out his suit jacket for the dry cleaner, a receipt fell out of the pocket, a crisp, white receipt from a high-end jeweler, a $20,000 watch, not a belt-tightening purchase. When I'd asked him about it, he'd laughed. A short, sharp, dismissive sound. It was a client retention gift, he'd explained, as if to a child, a necessary expense. Then came my bonus. My firm had landed a massive analytics contract, and I had been the lead. The bonus was significant, well into 6 figures. I was proud. I told him over dinner, expecting him to be, too. He'd smiled, that same patronizing smile, and called it insignificant. That's nice. Honey, he'd said, just a little something. We should just roll that into my main retirement fund. Let me protect it for you. We don't want you making any emotional decisions with it. My pride had curdled. He did not see it as my success. He saw it as another asset to be absorbed into his portfolio. The final piece was his contempt. It had been growing for years, but now it was open. He began to actively mock my job in front of our friends. He called it my boring clerical work. He referred to me as his little data entry girl. That was his mistake. Not the watch, not the lies, not even the email on the lock screen. It was the contempt. He had belittled my one true skill. He thought I was just a wife. He forgot I was an analyst. He forgot that I am trained to find the signal in the noise, to follow the data until the truth reveals itself. The moment he called my work clerical, I stopped being his wife. I became his auditor. So I stopped auditing data for my firm and started auditing my own life. I started auditing Julian. I didn't need to be a hacker. I didn't need to break down firewalls or guess 1,000 combinations. As an analyst, I know that human beings are the weakest link. We are creatures of habit, and Julian was the most predictable of all. His password for everything, his laptop, his bank, his personal vault was the same. It was the date he closed his first $1 million deal, a date he reminded me of every single anniversary, as a way to show me how far he had come. He was in the shower, a long, 30-minute steam shower, his daily ritual. It was more than enough time. I didn't just browse, I booted his laptop from an external drive loaded with a cloning utility. I made a perfect, bit-for-bit mirror of his entire system. It was all I needed. That night, long after he was asleep, I began my audit. His arrogance was staggering. He didn't even hide it well. He just buried it under layers of complexity he assumed I was too stupid to navigate. I found it in under an hour, a separate, meticulously maintained set of ledgers. It was a beautiful, complex, and utterly fraudulent system. It wasn't just poor trades. It was embezzlement. Julian was systematically siphoning money from his largest client accounts, including, most criminally, Robert Vance's personal retirement fund, and rerouting it. The transfers were small at first, masked as fees and foreign exchange charges, but they all ended up in the same place, a single undeclared shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. The company name was JCE Holdings. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't his initials. It wasn't clever. And then I saw the partner registration. The sole designated partner, the only other name on the account with signature authority. Chloe. Of course. The $20,000 watch wasn't a client retention gift. It was a bonus. I had the what and the how. I had the numbers, the spreadsheets, the wire transfer records. I could prove the theft. But I knew Julian. He would twist it. He would call it a mistake, a clerical error. He would blame a rogue algorithm. He would blame me. I needed the why. I needed the intent. I had all the data in the world, but I had no human element. I had the crime, but not the confession. So I gave him a chance to provide one. The next day, I bought the smallest, most sophisticated piece of surveillance equipment on the market, a voice-activated audio recorder, no bigger than a shirt button, with a 3-week battery life. While he was at the office, I went into his pristine home study, the one I was never supposed to touch, and affixed it to the underside of his massive mahogany desk, right near the front, where his chair would be. And then, I waited. For 2 weeks. Nothing. Just the sounds of him taking calls, the clicking of his keyboard, the rustle of papers. And then, 2 weeks ago, he came home early, and he wasn't alone. I heard their voices from the kitchen where I was pretending to read. Chloe. They went straight into the study and closed the door. They thought I was out, or perhaps they just didn't care. I didn't listen at the door. I didn't need to. I let them talk. I waited until they had left, until I heard the front door close and Julian call out that he was going back to the office with Chloe to finish a projection. I went into the study. I retrieved the recorder. I sat in his chair, plugged in my headphones, and hit play. I heard the clink of glasses. Ice. They were having a drink. I heard Chloe's laugh, high and sharp. And then I heard their voices, clear as a bell. They were talking about the auditors, an internal review scheduled for next week. They were getting close. Chloe sounded nervous, her voice a pitch higher than usual. They needed a plan. They needed an escape route. They needed a scapegoat, as she put it. And then I heard my husband laugh, a low, rolling, genuinely amused sound. "Don't worry about it," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "It's all taken care of. Alara is just so beautifully naive about money. Hopeless. I can easily frame her for a small initial theft. I'll start planting the seeds tonight." My mind snapped back from the memory, back from the quiet study and the click of the recorder, and into the absolute zero of the present. I was in the dining room. The screen behind me was a monument to their crime. The Cayman deficit, a 5,000 discrepancy. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the ticking of the ridiculous antique clock on the mantel, a sound I had never noticed before. It was suddenly deafening. Robert Vance's face was no longer pale. He was a man who lived in a world of cool, controlled blues and grays, but his face was now a deep, unhealthy, mottled red. It was the color of pressurized rage. He stared at the screen, his jaw working silently. When he finally turned, his movement was slow, a heavy rotation of his entire upper body, as if his neck muscles had locked. He did not look at me. He looked at Julian. His voice was not a shout. It was far, far more terrifying. It was a low, icy hiss that cut through the silence like a razor. Julian, what? Is this $5 million? Julian, who was still half standing, his hands braced on the table, looked like he had been struck. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, gasping sound came out. He was mute. I answered for him. My voice was clear and steady, the voice of a lecturer. He was skimming your retirement fund. Robert. He has been for almost 2 years. I clicked the remote. Slide 5 transaction log. R. Vance Personal Fund RVPF. The screen filled with a long, dense list of dates, codes, and amounts. He started small, I explained, my voice a calm counterpoint to the raw data on the screen. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, all disguised as foreign market advisory fees and administrative levies. But his own trades started to go bad about 6 months ago. He got desperate. He started taking larger and larger amounts to cover his own losses, hoping you'd never look at the raw data. He was robbing you to pay for his own incompetence. That is your $5 million hole. A chair shrieked against the marble floor. It was Chloe. She shot to her feet, her body rigid, her movements jerky and panicked. Her hip slammed into the table, and her full glass of Cabernet, the one she had been caressing all night, toppled, shattering against her plate. A spray of dark red wine exploded across the white linen tablecloth, looking exactly like an arterial wound. She's lying, she shrieked. The cool, pitying protege was gone. In her place was a cornered animal, all teeth and panic. Her voice was a cracked, hysterical thing. That's fake, all of it. She fabricated all of it. She pointed a trembling, wine-splattered finger at me. She's a vengeful bitch. She's crazy, Julian. Tell them she's crazy. Julian said nothing. He just stared at the screen. His entire world, the one he had built on bravado and my silence, evaporating in real time. I looked at Chloe, at the spreading stain of wine, at her face, which was twisted in a mask of ugly, terrified rage. I felt nothing. Fabricated, I asked, tilting my head slightly. That's a very serious accusation, Chloe. It's true. Numbers on a screen can be manipulated. Data can be skewed. You, of all people, should know that. I turned back to the screen. But you're right. I knew he would say I faked the ledgers. I knew he would claim it was all just a clerical error or a complex misunderstanding. That's why my evidence isn't just numbers. My thumb pressed the remote. The dense spreadsheet of his theft vanished. It was replaced by a simple, clean media player interface. In the center of the massive 85-inch screen, a single file was queued up. File audio, file Giants Final MP3. A new sound entered the room, a soft, collective gasp from the guests. I turned, very slowly, to look at Julian and Chloe. Her face, which had been red with rage, went a chalky, sickly white. She gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles turning white. I trust, I said, my voice resonating in the dead-still room, that you will both recognize your own voices. This file, I continued, was recorded in Julian's home office 2 weeks ago, the day you both came home early to finish a projection. Julian's head snapped up. The confusion, the rage, the denial, it all vanished, replaced by a single, profound emotion, pure, unadulterated horror. He was not looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at me. He was finally seeing me. And he was not just seeing the file. His mind was racing, connecting the dots, finally looking back at 2 weeks ago, at his desk, at my calm demeanor, and realizing the depth of the trap he had so arrogantly, so confidently, walked straight into. He knew exactly what was on that file. I raised the remote, my hand perfectly steady. I aimed it at the massive screen, past the wreckage of the table, past the frozen horror on my husband's face. I pressed play. The speakers, the ones Julian had spent a fortune on to create an immersive sensory experience, clicked on. The first sound that filled the dead, silent room was the clink of ice cubes in a heavy tumbler, and then his voice, Julian's voice, not the public-facing, charming baritone, but the private, conspiratorial version I knew so well. It was loud, it was pristine, it was inescapable. "The auditors are sniffing," his recorded voice said, smooth and confident. "We're out of time. We need an exit path, and we need it clean." Then, her voice, Chloe, high, sharp, and nervous. "And Alara. What about Alara? You said you could handle her." The room was so still I could hear Robert Vance's breathing, a low, ragged wheeze. Then came the final sound, the sound I had listened to over and over in my own study, Julian's laugh, a low, rolling, genuinely amused sound. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Ilara." "Of course," his voice echoed, bouncing off the marble and glass. "I'll frame a small theft first, maybe $50K. Make her look impulsive and stupid. When the 5 million blows up, everyone will believe she panicked and liquidated everything. She'll be the perfect scapegoat. She won't even know what hit her." The audio file clicked off. The screen went black. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Chloe made a small, wet, choking sound. Her eyes, wide and vacant, rolled back. She didn't faint. She simply collapsed, sliding out of her chair like a discarded doll, landing in a heap of red silk and spilled wine on the floor. Robert Vance stood. His movement was not fast, but it was violent, his chair screeching against the floor. His phone was already in his hand, his thumb on a contact. He didn't look at Julian. He was done looking at Julian. "Security," he barked into the phone, his voice a low, brutal command. "This is Vance. Lock Julian's and Chloe's offices. Now, freeze their terminal access. No one enters, no one leaves. And get Boston PD. Get them to my penthouse. Now." The word PD was the trigger. It was the sound that broke Julian's paralysis. He didn't speak. He roared. It was a guttural animal sound of pure, terrified rage. He lunged, not at me, but at the television. He scrambled across the table, his feet crushing crystal and china, and clawed at the wall, trying to rip the USB drive from its port. I didn't move. I didn't even flinch. "Don't bother. Julian." He froze, his hand inches from the drive. He turned, his chest heaving, his face a grotesque mask of wine, sweat, and terror. "That copy," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his ragged breathing, "is just for the show." He stared, his mind finally catching up, finally understanding the depth of his miscalculation. I looked him directly in the eye, letting him see the cold, hard contempt I had been saving. "The full evidence package," I said clearly. "The ledgers, the wire transfers, the original audio, and a full analysis of your shell company was sent to the SEC, the entire Viridian Board of Directors, and my divorce attorney 10 minutes ago, right before you started your speech." I turned and picked up my clutch from the sideboard. A simple black clutch, the first one I had ever bought with my own paycheck. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking decisively on the marble. "Ilara." I heard a crash behind me. He had fallen from the table, landing among the shards of Chloe's shattered glass. He was on his hands and knees. "Ilara, wait." "You can't." He choked, the words wet with desperation. "You've ruined me. You've ruined me." I stopped at the threshold of the dining room. I turned and looked back one last time at the wreckage. At the wine-stained linen, the shattered glass, the catatonic form of his mistress, the apoplectic rage of his boss, and at my husband, my powerful, brilliant husband, kneeling in the filth. "No, Julian," I said, the words clean and final. "You ruined yourself. You just accused the wrong person." I turned and stepped out into the foyer and walked out the front door. I left him there, in the dead, suffocating silence of the perfect dinner he had planned. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts. Remember to subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and give that hype button a little tap to help more people hear this.